My name is Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at the Stimson Center. It's great to see so many new faces. For our foreign visitors, you have to recognize that Washington, D.C. does not operate in the rain. It closes the city down. So there will be folks, I think, continuing to enter the room, and I hope you do not find that to be disruptive. We are expecting a very crowded room kind of through the day as well. However, for those of you who may have mistakenly walked in, this is not the Donald Trump rally. That is occurring two doors down. But welcome to Stimson. You know, over our 30-year history as an organization here at Stimson, we've really prided ourselves on two things. And I think that this event over the next couple of days really represents what at least Stimson we feel we do best. And it's first, it's bringing together a group of uncommon constituencies to work on grand global challenges of our time. And secondly, it is doing so in a much more pragmatic way. It is not about contributing to the hot air that circulates around this town, around virtually any policy issue, but really about rolling our sleeves up and thinking critically and as I say, very pragmatically about some of these challenges and how we can contribute in a much more effective way to the policy-making process. So for us, we are really honored to be the host, co-host with two fine organizations. And I first want to call out Dr. Mciahel Stohl, who is the director of the Orfalea Center at UC Santa Barbara. This is an organization that we have begun to develop a relationship with that, thanks to you, Mciahel, that is engaged in some very rigorous, deep academic research on this issue and on many of the other issues that Stimson has worked on over the course of the past several decades. And so, Mciahel, we're very grateful to you for helping to facilitate this conference and for your role in bringing us all together. We're especially grateful as well to the president of the Trends Research and Advocacy in Abu Dhabi, Dr. Ahmed Hamli, whom you will be hearing from in just a moment. This is a unique opportunity, I think, for us to begin to discuss this wider issue of terrorism, of countering violent extremism, and bringing together a set of regional voices as well. We recognize that this is not an American problem, this is not a problem in the Middle East, this is a truly global problem. And so to the extent, I think, that we can begin to reach out beyond Washington, D.C. and include voices globally, it is, I think, essential to addressing this incredibly complex challenge of global terrorism. And Dr. Hamli, I'm very grateful to you for facilitating this particular event. I think we are in undoubtedly for 2 days of very stimulating discussion. It is an action-packed, I think, agenda that you have in your hands. And with that, I would just again welcome you to Stimson. I would like to thank again our co-hosts, and Ahmed, I would like to welcome you to the dais and to Washington.
Good morning and welcome everybody to this event. Construction of Terrorism, Challenges that the World Facing, created by Daesh. I want to thank Mr. Breen for his cooperation and co-organizing and hosting this event. I wish also to thank Mciahel Stohl and his team at Orfalea Center for our continuing partnership. The threat of terrorism is all around us. It is unfortunate that no one day passes without terrorism being in the news. Of course, we are also seeing just about every act of violence being labeled as terrorism, a development that's not useful for effort in removing the threats. In December 2015, Trends and Orfalea Center held an engaging 2-day conference on construction of terrorism. There, we discussed and debated how we understand what is or is not terrorism and how this influences our responses and reactions. This week's events is a continuation of this Construction of Terrorism project. Over the next 2 days, we'll be addressing how the threat and actions of Daesh have disrupted our world and what we can do to overcome the threats faced. There are, of course, no easy answers or responses, as we currently struggle to understand exactly what Daesh is, how it operates, how its message appeals to others. We need a diverse and integrated approaches in addressing the threats posed by Daesh. States around the world also need to cooperate in their response. While much more can and needs to be done at all levels, we also have to make sure we do not overdo it. Terrorism seeks to disrupt our day-to-day lives. It strives to put fear in our hearts, preventing us from living our lives. We cannot let our responses to disrupt our lives as well. This is no easy task, and our invited experts will be putting forth a range of ideas and practical solutions for addressing the challenges we face. We hope that this will feed into the ongoing discussions among government officials, international organizations, and the general public. Once again, I wish to thank Stimson Center and Orfalea Center for their cooperation and partnerships. I hope you find the conference useful and the presentation and discussions helpful. Thank you very much. Yes, now, Michael, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks once again to Brian Finlay and his team here, who have made all the arrangements and made it easy for us to come from far to simply arrive and find an audience, and all the arrangements made, and we much appreciate it. And thank you also to Ahmed and the Trends Center, Trends Advisory rather, for all their help and our continuing partnership, and we look forward to this tripart partnership building further. I'm going to be brief in introducing our speakers today. I'm going to summarily introduce in the sense that we have three people here who, among them, probably have more than 50 years worth of time spent studying terrorism. Each brings a very different perspective to the topic. I think you'll find the differences to be quite useful in terms of stimulating your thought. And this is just guessing on the basis of what I know of their work in the past. And I think that we will proceed. You have long biographies of relatively long in terms of an introduction. I'm not going to read to you what's on there. But I want to stress that we're going to, each person will speak 15 to 20 minutes. I'll monitor, and then we'll have questions as a group afterward. Given our late start, I want to make sure there's enough time that everybody has time for presentation, and then the questions to follow. Okay, so we will begin with Mark Sageman, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you very much. I think I came to the wrong conference. I think my paper is the only one that does not deal with Daesh or ISIS. There is like an echo on this table. That's a little bit disturbing. The people here, you hear this metallic? Anyway, I'll try not to move. As a matter of fact, I'll just talk like this. I want to address the constructions of terrorism. And the construction of terrorism, and basically how people have constructed terrorism or thought about terrorism, or what we call terrorism, over the past 240 years. And one of the lessons is that whatever comes out at the time of, an attack or an incident of violence is usually wrong. You have to wait for a while. So whatever you're going to hear today, the odds is that more than 50% of what you hear is going to be wrong. The problem is that we don't know which one at this point, but in 5 years, it'll become crystal clear. So, how did people kind of confront this? How did they conceptualize it? How did they write about it? And, when you do something like this, where do you start? I decided to start at the French Revolution because the French Revolution changed things in Western Europe. It expanded the political arena so that a lot of people now were involved in politics as opposed to just becoming violence being a palace coup. And it really consolidated the monopoly of violence within a territory within the state, except for the United States, because of the Second Amendment. Which has really kind of very interesting implication because the United States always kind of stands apart from other Western countries as far as terrorism is concerned. And also the French Revolution became the inspiration for waves of politically violent people. You know, we only started calling them terrorists after the 1930s. Before that, they were the anarchists. And not anarchists in terms of their philosophy, anarchist in its original term, meaning hating anarchy, hating any hierarchy, you know, so meaning hating the state. Unfortunately, in the 19th century, some people developed a theory of anarchists and people became confused, and so they started using a second term. But in the 19th century and earlier 20th century, if you see anything about terrorism, it's about anarchism. All right, so how do people conceptualize the violence around them? Well, three ways. The first way is, of course, the actors themselves. What did the actors, and this is something that nobody really cares about because it turns out that terrorist researchers, like the state, they do not identify with the actors, the terrorists. They see the terrorists as outsiders, and therefore they stereotype them almost immediately. And, you know, all our wrong conceptions comes from this identification with the state as opposed to the challengers. So what do the actors, how do they conceive of their own violence? They're very similar then and now. Namely, that you know, they were forced to do things by what they call la force des choses, by circumstances, the strength of things. And so, you know, why'd you do that? Well, you know, I was starving. Those guys, you know, I had to do something, and this guy was trying to kill me. And this is very similar to you know, what the people who participate in the Journée Révolutionnaire during the French Revolution or the sans-culottes, you know, that was the rationale. So what about the outsiders? Well, there are two versions of what the outsiders thought. The furthest out, you have the vision that they're just a bunch of ideological fanatics. This is, of course, what a British guy, Edmund Burke, you know, wrote about the French Revolution. But the guys are a little bit closer and more sophisticated. They all became conspiracy theorists. Turns out that Abbé Baruel, who actually started this trend in 1895, also writing in England, because he would have been guillotined in France, you know, came up with the idea that all of this, you know, could not have happened by chance, and it was guided by this large conspiracy, which he felt were the Freemasons, especially the Illuminati, which was a small Freemason, Bavarian Freemason group that only existed for about 3 or 4 years in the 1780s. Now, you know, if you look at your internet, the Illuminati are still there. To my surprise, I mean, nobody knows who the hell they are. but, you know, Daesh and, you know, Al-Qaeda and so on. I mean, it's really kind of incredible, you know, that a group, you know, stayed that way. But anyway, and, you know, there are 4 arguments to be made for conspiracy theory. One is nothing happens by chance. The second one is appearances are deceptive. You know, so in a sense, forget about empirical reality. And third is that everything is connected. The fourth one is that everything is top down. And that, unfortunately, has stayed with us. Even for those non-conspiracy theory, it's always a great man, what the leaders do, they decide, and then kind of trickles down to the little foot soldiers flawlessly, and it gets implemented. That hasn't changed very much. So, it's very much a great man theory of history, and, and history is done by mindless little followers. But the people who doubt me, in terms of starting my narrative with the French Revolution, let me remind you that the French Revolution was the site of the first suicide bomber. The guy killed 25 people in 1789 in December, blew up, 25 soldiers. And it was also the site of the first truck bomb, on Christmas Eve 1800, when they tried to kill Bonaparte at the time. It was really, of course, Saint-Nicaise killed 8 people. So, this is terrorism. I don't know how you guys, call, but somehow the first 80 years of the history of terrorism has been completely ignored by historians of terrorists. And I'll come to that why. So in the first part of the 19th century, basically until Napoleon III or Metternich and so on in Vienna, the conspiracy theories predominated. So if you are faced with a conspiracy, what are you going to do? Well, the state develops a police state. That's when they have surveillances, that's where you have international cooperation in Europe, sting operation, and centralizing. Plus the centralization of power in one man, you now have a transformation from mobs, which are now surveilled and can be anticipated, to smaller groups trying to kill. And so that shift happened in the first part of the 19th century. The second part of the 19th century, and by that I mean mostly from the Paris Commune onwards, you have in the history of terrorism, huge gaps. And the huge gaps is really the neglect of local resistance to occupation, Western occupation. So all the colonialists, nobody cared about those savages. They were just being slaughtered by the glorious Western soldiers. In Africa, in the Middle East, in the Americas. And in this country, because it's so different, you have a very successful southern insurrection against the North that killed the Reformation after the Civil War, basically through vigilante groups. Not the state, vigilante groups, and the state, adopted most of the laws to try to reestablish slavery. So the focus was on emerging revolutionary group, nationalists, communists, and you guys are going to ask me, communists? There were no communists in the 19th century. Correct. There were no communists in terms of the Communist Party, but what people called communists in the 19th century were the descendants of the Paris Commune. They were the anarchists. So, the nightmare for an industrialist in the United States was, oh my God, they're going to do a Paris Commune on us. Those are communists. And of course, most of the communists in the Paris Commune were not communists. They were just, workers for the right and anarchists. And you have class race struggle, especially in the South, and the introduction of explosives. You also have, at the end of the 19th century, the first wave of terrorism research. And this is very interesting because it's really research about the French Revolution. The historians working with primary sources were fairly sympathetic, and they bought this idea that the perpetrators were forced to do violence by la force des choses again. And you have two groups, and they escalated the conflict of retaliation to the point of violence. The scientists were rather hostile, except for Lombroso. Lombroso actually did not think that terrorists were, or anarchists as you would call them, were criminals. They actually sacrificed themselves for the greater good. They were humanitarians as far as he was concerned, but everybody else thought that they were psychopaths. Now, most of the social scientists looking at this really thought that they were crowd phenomena because, to them, the Paris Commune, it's a Haymarket Square, it's a French Revolution, so they really kind of thought that this was really an outgrowth of crowd phenomena. And so you have Gustave Le Bon coming up with this notion, says, so how do people in a crowd become savages? And he claimed that it was a degeneration to a more primitive state of being that make people suggestible to suggestion, or suggestion at that time meant hypnosis by charismatic leader. And that's why crowds were. And this has been a very popular argument, one that was adopted by Hitler, one that was in Mussolini, all those, and even 1950s until about 1960, until social movement theory started discrediting this. But this Le Bon's theory was very strong. So what do you have in the 20th century? Well, conspiracy theories. Now, it's no longer the Red Scare, Bolshevik, but you also have Jews. You have, the writing of the Protocol of the Elders of Zion. That's a conspiracy theory, and that also now stood the test of time for about a century. The Red Scare. But you had a problem. Now you had a lot of nation, and you had people who kind of committing crime other places, and states wanted to repatriate, extradite the people. So the League of Nations decided to have a whole convention of repression and punishment of international terrorists, and to define the term to be able to extradite the people they wanted. And they could not arrive at a definition except by the effect of the action. So a terrorist is one who terrorizes. And that was actually Lemkin's suggestion, Lemkin of the genocide fame. That was his, very much suggestion of this. And people started using terrorism, and the word anarchist starting disappearing from the vocabulary because it was replaced by terrorist. Now, who were the terrorists in the 1930s? The most common use of terrorists were against the KKK in the United States because they actually did go out lynching and terrorizing people. And during World War II, anybody against a Nazi were terrorists. So the French resistance, they were called terrorists at the time, if you look at the French newspapers on the Vichy. After World War II, we have a brand new way of looking at terrorists. From 1947 to 1962, they had a debate on state terrorism and focus on Russia. This is where history has been rewritten, and the start of terrorism now comes to Vera Zizouli's shooting Trepov in 1878, because now the focus is all on Russia. But that's because of the Cold War. People have forgotten the long history of terrorism, which the Haymarket guys knew the history of terrorism, if you look at the 19th century, but no longer, the 1950s. So you have a big debate on Russia. You also have something new, which is a glorification of national liberation fronts. You have a lot of novels that glorifies them, like Leon Uris' Exodus. What do you think it is? It's basically a glorification of terrorists. Paul Newman looks great as a terrorist. I don't know about you, but he's my terrorist, my dream terrorist. And, you have people start looking at studies on insurrection and revolution. By the way, the local voices, Mciahel Begin, Mao, Fanon, Che Guevara. So in the 60s, terrorism was seen in terms of counterinsurgency. And then, you had urban violence, and you had several commissions to kind of deal with urban violence with the National Commission. And there you had the start of very interesting ideas of why terrorism took place. You had the J-curve, which is based on the frustration-aggression hypothesis. You had Ted Gurr with his relative deprivation theory. In the 1970s, the Palestinians finally come in, not as Muslims, but as socialists. Films depict them as terrorists, and you have the failure of UN efforts to define the problem. And you have a shift from counterinsurgency now to counterterrorism, especially in Washington think tank, in the RAND Corporation, the CSIS across the street. And you have the birth of security, the industry, ex-government official, joining the think tank and kind of bringing that along. The 1980s, finally, you have academia, the second wave of academic studies on terrorism. You still have new conspiracy theory, especially with the Jonathan Institute in Israel, where all the neocons belong to. The idea was the Soviets were behind every terrorist action around the world. That Claire Sterling, the terror network, very much emphasized that. And the empirical studies were actually, some of them were very good. You had the Germans interviewing 228 Baader-Meinhof guys, the Red Brigade, where about 1,000 of them were interviewed. Jews, we say with Sprinzak, looking at the right-wing terrorism in Israel. You had 3 journals. Alex Schmidt had his his volume on the various definitions of terrorism. And you had wonderful edited volumes in philosophy, psychology, social psychology, and some skeptical studies. In the 90s, it was a discovery of religious terrorism, motivated terrorism. And those are Muslim, Jews, Christian identities, Buddhists. And at the same time, you have a start of concern of the weapon of mass destruction, especially chemicals with Shinrikyo and Zarashnishis. And so people say, well, are the two linked? So is there a new terrorism? And there were arguments about that. But the big change came post 9/11, when you had an explosion of experts, especially on the internet. There were bloggers who used leaks and Islamist conspiracy theory. The government did no better because it developed in-house expertise, people with a BA who could pass a clearance, and really having no rigorous methodology, graduate methodology. And having all kinds of bias and an alarmist view of theorists. And you have government funding, a kind of terrorist industrial complex now that wanted quick fixes, social network analysis. Now the big thing is using neuroimaging to identify terrorists. I mean, all kinds of, it's the American toilet flush response. You flush the toilet, it flushes. We want a quick fix because that's where, but you actually start having the academic research. But unfortunately, that's still hampered by the narrowness of the academic disciplines. We almost have to do your dissertation under one discipline as opposed to cross-disciplinary studies, and still only have superficial data. So I'm famous for saying that because the government has access to all the data, but no methodology, the government knows everything but understands nothing. Whereas academics who know all the methodology but have access to no data, they understand everything but they know nothing. But you can see how this evolved over time. So conclusion, terrorist studies are influenced by the threat du jour. Scholars self-categorize against terrorists and therefore are full of biases, looking at things top-down. And, because all the funding is from the government, you have self-censorship of things that you don't really want to get into, i.e. the state contribution to violence. People stay away from that, even though it's a huge contribution. If you think that, the violence is really a conflict between two parties that escalate to violence, well, just the escalation of one party doesn't explain the second one. So you have that type of censorship. So what's the possibility of true terrorism research? I think that we start appreciating the necessity of relying on primary sources, so field studies, trial transcript, and discovering materials in trial, historical analysis, because a lot of those now documents that were classified now open, a century later. Critical studies, I think, was a good addition. It challenged the counterterrorist perspective of the state, but unfortunately it has its own conspiracy theories as well. So, it's not total clean. There's some development in cognitive and social psychology. I like the social identity perspective. I heard yesterday the social dominance perspective. You have the heuristic of Kahneman and Tversky. So, that to us really kind of make us conscious of our own biases so we can transcend them in the future. And finally, the use of new methodologies such as Bayesian analysis for low base rate event like terrorism, which are extremely important, especially for watch lists like the no-fly list, or sting operation, which is based on predisposition, which is really a Bayesian exercise. So that's all I have to say. I hope you're not too depressed. I think you should go and have some coffee to perk you up.
Not yet.
And listen. Oh, those guys are even more depressing than I am.
I am even more depressing again, so.
All right, that's my 2 cents.
Well, thank you, Mark. We'll move in a second to Laura Dugan while she gets set. What I hope you'll see over the next 2 days is that while each of us is not fully interdisciplinary, what we have tried to do in terms of the people who are presenting is, in fact, a set of disciplines that bring different perspectives and different methodologies and different theoretical approaches so that some of what we hope, what Mark is talking about, we can overcome somewhat, even if we still get 50% of it at least wrong and don't know which 50%.
So I was wondering how I was going to follow that, but I think I'm I think I'm going to hone in on the concept of how the U.S. government or the governments think they can just flush a toilet and everything will be done instantly, because I really like that image, and it does speak to what I'm going to talk about. I also want to highlight the
Call it the Sageman phenomenon.
I like the toilet flushing phenomenon, but if you want to be associated with that, that's fine. So I'm actually also not directly talking about Daesh, but I am bringing it a little bit closer up to the present time. And I'm also going to be I'm going to be looking at it from a very different perspective. I'm not a historian. I'm actually technically a criminologist. My background's public policy, and I do a lot of data analysis and data collection. And so I've been, in the years that I've been studying terrorism, it's like we have all this amazing information on what terrorists do. Now, whether it's amazing or not is up for grabs, I'm sure, at the front table here. But the point is that we found ways to measure it, but we've known very little about what governments do. It's only what is obvious and what's apparent at the time. So the work that I'm going to be presenting today, it's relevant to Daesh in the sense that we look at how different government actions have affected Muslim extremist actions, Muslim terrorism, so to speak. I focus in on the U.S. and Canada because that's where we've collected data, but I do think it will offer some insight. And I'm going to start with, once I figure out how to get to the next slide, I'm going to start with the war on terror. So while I'll be talking about some things that happened before 9/11, I'm going to, the war on terror is this concept that has, was developed probably first mentioned by Bush in 2001. You can see that this is a quote in which it came up that's highly cited. I'm going to have to look at my slides. So our war on terror begins with al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated, hence the toilet flushing. And so within the first 100 days of of this declaration, you can see the State Department did a report, and you can see a lot of the different efforts that went into place in order to stop al-Qaeda and its global reach, including diplomacy and terrorist finances and having a military campaign, which is probably a lot bigger than the other ones that are listed here, as well as some law enforcement and others. I don't know if these slides will be available for, I'm not going to, with the 20 minutes I have, I'm not going to be reading everything, but you certainly can have a copy of the slides if you want them. So that leads to the question, that was within the first 100 days, but here we are many years later, and what is the consensus or belief on how effective the war on terror was? Well, I've discovered in my travels that there's a very different perspective within the U.S. than there is outside of the U.S. If you look within the U.S., particularly now during an election year, what you hear is a lot of, well, we probably shouldn't have invaded Iraq, but who knows? And then there's a lot of discussion about what we should do about Daesh and ISIL. And, well, we should keep our troops off the ground, but we need to be involved. And so it's like, again, the toilet flushing. We need to, we need to stop this, and we need to find a way to stop it. We have this hammer or this toilet, and we need to know where to direct it. However, research suggests that research within the U.S., although as well as outside, suggests that the war on terror is actually causing more harm than good, that it may not necessarily be a good thing. And that there's research that I've done with my colleague Erica Chenoweth, who's also a co-author on this, where we found that there is some value at looking at conciliatory policies, particularly those that affect the constituencies of those who the terrorists fight for, which is actually not that different from what Dr. Sageman was just talking about. Now, outside the U.S., we have a very different perspective. Basically, you don't have to go very far to hear people say that the war on terror has ruined lives, that it has actually created a larger base for recruitment for the global jihad, and so it's one of those, like, our toilet's not very good if it's actually creating bigger mess than it is at reducing any harm. Many of the nations, however, are still involved with the war on terror despite this consensus. They're still doing it. And then there's a growing consensus among academics, some that we'll hear from today, that basically will say that part of the problem with the war on terror is that it's a very indiscriminate problem, and that's what we find in our research too, is that the efforts that are being set forth to address it are very indiscriminate, affecting these constituencies, again, making a larger base from which to draw recruits, as opposed to discrete, and so where they target those who are actually guilty or at least suspected of doing harm. And so perhaps the way to address it is not militaristically, but through the justice system or through some sort of law enforcement where those who are not involved aren't affected. Anyway, so these are all just things these are all just ideas, but they do lead to some hypotheses. And since I have data, and I'll talk about the data in a second, this at least gives us some direction from which to look. And so basically, what I'm saying is that indiscriminate repression and punishment reduces terrorism. That's a toilet flushing hypothesis. So I don't necessarily buy it, but it's what policy is made on, and this is what's been driving the war on terror, is that we need to show how strong we are. We need to show that if you go up against us, we're going to fight you and you're going to get hurt and we're going to win. I mean, all of the rhetoric around the war on terror is about defeating. And so that's one side. And the other side is that it actually is associated with an increase in terrorism, just like Dr. Sageman was saying, is that if you only focus on the violence of one side, ignore the violence of the other side, it's harder to see what's going on. And then also there's this other idea is that perhaps conciliatory policies, particularly toward those who are vulnerable to being recruited by these organizations, that they may have that might be a promising avenue toward reducing terrorism. And so how do we get at this? That's like the big question. Well, my colleague and I, Erica Chenoweth and I, have been working pretty hard in collecting a database that looks at government actions, and we collect this from open source data. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about that database. That's what I talked about last conference, and that took the whole time. But I can tell you that the goal of it is to include any action by the government that's relevant to terrorist organizations or their constituencies. Now, I'm going to show you a graph that we created before we ever collected the data, and I think we've been pretty successful in doing this. We wanted an event database that captures a full range of government actions from fully conciliatory to repressive. We wanted to be able to identify whether those actions are discriminate, meaning that they only affect those who are suspected of wrongdoing, or indiscriminate, meaning that innocent people are affected. We want to be able to capture whether the actions are material, something like making an arrest or raiding a town, or non-material, like hostile language, or even, it's conciliatory as well, so it could be praising others. We want actions by the judiciary, by law enforcement, by politicians, and the military. And so that's really the goal of the data is that we want to be able to have as many of these actions as possible. And so we've done that, and I'll give you just a half a minute version of how we've done that. Is we basically downloaded Reuters news stories for most of the countries that we look at, but then we've now gone into LexisNexis to get more localized papers. We downloaded everything relevant to the countries that we're focusing on, used a textual analysis program to extract the lead sentences and code them according to who the actor is and who the target is, as well as the action. We've kept all actors that were government actors, and all actions and where the target was a terrorist organization or their constituency. And then we kept every single action so that we could capture the full range from conciliatory to repression. We have a lot of neutral actions as well. The data that I'm going to present today, or the analysis that I'm going to present today, looks at the United States prior to 9/11, mostly because I'm still cleaning the United States after 9/11. It's actually a really big job. Our coders actually just finished coding the Bush years, but they did finish. I've cleaned the Clinton years, so that's what we're looking at. But we did collect Gate Canada as well, which I'll be looking at that after 9/11. So we'll be able to look at those. And what you can see here is for the U.S., we had 3,316 U.S. government actions that were relevant to terrorist organizations or the constituencies during the 1990s or during the Clinton administration. Of those, 1,799 were relevant to Muslims. I coded repressive, conciliatory, and neutral, 562 repressive, 875 conciliatory, 362 neutral. And terrorism was used. We basically just used the global terrorism database, and we took every action that was by a known Muslim perpetrator that attacked inside the United States or U.S. interests overseas. It's a narrow way to define it, but the great thing is that this is all event data, so we can look at it many different ways. Now, for Canada, there were more actions, but it's a longer period of time from September 2001 to December 2013. We had 5,346 gate actions, 2,673 relevant to Muslims. You could see that 1,600 were repressive, 500 conciliatory, 500 neutral. And then there wasn't a lot of terrorism relevant to Canadians during this period, but there's an organization that collected data on extremist behavior targeting Canada, and we used their data and combined it with some other data to look at. We basically are looking at extremist events, so it doesn't meet the threshold of many terrorist definitions, but it's extremist activity or law breaking. Typically violent law breaking. And so that's the data that we look at. Here you can see these are graphs of the blue is conciliatory actions, red are repressive actions, and the dark line going through are the terrorist attacks or the extremist actions for Canada. And so, and just to point out, I actually lifted this from other research, but But for Canada, both in the GTD and also in the Canadian extremist database, there are a lot of acts that were perpetrated by people we don't know. The acts look like extremist events. Even in the GTD, it's labeled as terrorism, but we're unable to attribute it to anyone. For this research, I'm going to focus mostly on those for which we know that the perpetrator was a Muslim extremist. However, we know we're missing some things, but the dashed line here shows that. So I'm going to focus on the United States. How am I with time?
10 minutes.
Okay, good. So the U.S. during this period, let me just talk about some of the actions that were going on during the Clinton years that were relevant to Muslims. Again, these actions are anything relevant to Muslims because we're focusing on terrorist acts by Muslim extremists, and the Muslims in general are the constituencies. The U.S. was heavily involved in negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians after the Oslo agreements, and so a lot of the data is describing those efforts of trying to bring peace. A lot of it's neutral because they were they were hosting meetings and things like that. However, there was also many efforts in which the U.S. worked really hard to try to get Israel to agree to some of the demands that the Palestinians had. And back and forth. There was also reactions to terrorist attacks, reactions to the bombings of the U.S. military complex in Saudi Arabia, and also the reactions to the embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, prosecution of the 1993 World Trade Center. Let me point out, because I'm using the Global Terrorism Database, the 1993 data are actually missing, and so that limits some of the analysis. Unfortunately, however, we do have all the prosecutions of those cases, and there was a lot of things that went on around that. And then also, the U.S. was involved to some extent of trying to control the Kurds in Turkey, and so they were very excited and were very verbal when Aslan was captured. So those are the things that were going on. Now, I'm going to show you a bunch of results, and right now I'm going to explain how to read these results. As you saw from the graph, terrorism is a pretty rare event in the U.S., relatively rare in Canada. I used a method called generalized additive model. Is a non-parametric way to just look at relationships, and it allows the relationship to be nonlinear or however it should be. However, just to see whether it would hold up statistically, I also ran negative binomial models. Now, these models deal with for anyone who's a statistician in the room, there's a lot of simultaneity going on. There's a lot of back and forth between government actors and terrorists, and so what we did is we controlled for many lags of the terrorism to try to get it to be one directional. So it's kind of like using the ideas behind vector autoregression. For the non-statisticians in the room, I'll stop now and be willing to talk to other people later. But we control for a lot of things here to try to isolate the directionality. And that's what's pretty important. I know it doesn't do it perfectly, but it does a pretty darn good job. This is just throwing everything in the pot as if distinctions between government actions and terrorist attacks doesn't matter. And what you can see, if we saw an effect, what we'd want to see is that line to be going downward and that all the gray area clearing the horizontal line. So we'd want to see just a downward slope. This NS means not significant, and that shouldn't be surprising. So this is just kitchen sink model. We don't see anything. And then I broke it up. So this is looking at conciliatory and repressive actions that are relevant to Muslims, looking at just all terrorist attacks that attack either U.S. here or overseas. And what we see is that this is the right-hand side is repressive, the left-hand side is conciliatory. We don't see anything. We could kind of see the repressive looks like there might be some sort of deterrence, but it's unclear. It's not significant. And then on the right side, there seems to be a nonlinear effect where there might be a slight increase and then a decrease. Again, the graph, particularly the wide gray area, suggests that it's not entirely promising. But we can look at it a little further because we group together conciliatory and repressive, ignoring discriminant and indiscriminate. But when we break these down, we actually still don't see a whole lot, but we start to see some trends. And so we want to look at this a little further. And I only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to go pretty quickly. I broke it down by whether it happens within the U.S. or overseas. And as you can see, there were actually only 3 attacks that happened in the US during the 90s. So this is a super rare event model, so rare that I'm actually not going to analyze what's happening in the US. But if you look overseas, there were 20 attacks, and 3 of them I want to highlight, that the ones that I just are the ones where Al-Qaeda came on the scene. So what we see are the embassy attacks, and then also a precursor to the Cole attack, and then the Cole attack itself. And so I'm going to look at just overseas actions. You can see that now if we throw them all in, we see a little bit more of a decrease, although it's still not significant when we run the empirical model. When we break it by conciliatory repressive, again, we see something very similar than what we saw before. And I offer these slides to anyone who wants to look at them slower later. But then when we break it down by discriminate and indiscriminate, we see this really odd positive conciliatory finding that I'll come back to at the end, because of course what we need to, an increase with conciliatory, which is, again, but this is discriminate. So this is basically saying when the U.S. was nice to terrorists, there was more terrorism. And this is, while I know I'm being videotaped, this isn't my final conclusion here, but what it is suggesting is that we need to look more deeper into what's going on here, and I do on a later slide. I hope I get to it. In Canada, the trends, you could see that the trends match pretty closely with the now what's interesting about this is that these are 2 very different data collection methods, and yet they do track pretty closely. When we break it down, I'm just diving into the results. So looking at Canadian, I'm focusing here on Afghanistan because a lot of the Muslim actions that the Canadians were involved in were Afghanistan related. This is after 9/11, and so they went over there and helped. So we want to look at attacks on Canadians in Afghanistan and the actions that the Canadian government were involved in over there. And what you can see here is that while we see some interesting patterns with conciliatory, the top 2 graphs, the bottom ones really show this positive association with repression. And so this gets at what Dr. Sageman was saying, is that when you have more violence, there's more violence. So you have to look at both sides of the violence. And this is, by the way, a persistent finding that we've been finding in a lot of different analyses that we've done with the GATE data, and yet we still, it's still our #1 policy response to terrorism. Now, other findings from Canada, we look at repressive discriminate actions toward so in Canada we call them Al-Qaeda-inspired suspects as opposed to Muslim extremists. But if we look at discriminate actions, this is repressive discriminate and repressive indiscriminate. What we see is this repressive, the one on the right shows that when there's, so repressive indiscriminate means that these are actions in Canada that targeted Muslims. So that shows that again, that violence. Now, looking at, we wanted to look at whether actions in Afghanistan affected attacks in the Canadian homeland. And while nothing is significant here, what it does suggest, the patterns in the data suggest that when Canadians were behaving conciliatory in Afghanistan, there was a decrease. It was flat and then a decrease. And then again, when there was repression in Afghanistan, there may have been some repression back home as well. So, and then this last piece is actually quite interesting, and I haven't had time to dig into it, but I will. What we see here is that when we have this, looking at actions in the Canadian homeland that are directed toward Muslims, there seems to be an increase in Al-Qaeda's inspired attacks in Canada. Now, I broke this up by conciliatory and repressive, and it seems like it's an indiscriminate thing, which is opposite of what we would anticipate here. But like I said, I want to look deeper into this. I'm going to move a little bit faster because I have less than 2 minutes. Focusing in on, and this might speak to what we just talked now, I want to focus in on the U.S. study and what kind of conclusions we can come to from that. Basically, there were many Muslim relevant actions by the U.S. government, but very few terrorist attacks attacks, but I do want to focus in on the fact that al-Qaeda was sort of coming up toward the end of this and suggesting that there may have been a buildup. I mean, as I was reading these government actions, it seemed clear, like as a time traveler, that something like 9/11 was probably on its way. However, when we do get to the analysis of the Bush years, I think things will get a lot more clear. Conciliatory acts toward Muslim suspects appeared to be so associated with more terrorism. When I looked at that more closely, there were only 16 actions total during this period, and 9 involved Palestinians, 4 involved Hezbollah, and so there was, and then Chechens. And this is during a period where Clinton was involved with negotiations between states and other rebels. So anyway, this is something, again, that's worth looking at. None of it was significant, but we do think it's going to be more promising once we see more of the data post 9/11. In Canada, we've definitely found this pattern of repression leads to more repression. However, we want to look more closer at this idea that conciliation toward Muslims might produce some sort of backlash. Just to end on my broader conclusions, and that is basically that repression does not seem to work when addressing terrorism. And again, not to say that people who break the law shouldn't be dealt with, but I do think that it might be more important, and we can look at this with the data, to have more of a law enforcement focus than a dropping bombs on towns focus. We still need to learn how specific conciliatory actions relate to violence, particularly when those actions are directed towards those who are suspects and those who aren't. And then also, I think what's important is to realize that actions by one government might affect a broader geographical area or other victims. I limited the analysis by focusing on just targets, attacks that targeted U.S. or Canada, but it's going to be worth looking at a broader set of targets. And then, and again, I promise the next steps will be looking at what happens after 9/11 in the U.S. Thank you.
And it's quite disconcerting for somebody who was associated with the beginnings of critical terrorism studies in the 2005 at Aberystwyth to be told by Mark Sageman that we might have a point. We've been so used to being demonized and seen as part of the problem that it's quite disconcerting and disorganizing for me for someone to suggest that I might be part of the solution. So, having explained my disconcertion, I'll proceed apace, and I'm going to try and read from my laptop rather than going over my head here. So I'm trying to do 2 things at once, if I may. Oh, thank you. That's great. Yes, it seems to have moved around a little bit. Okay. So what I want to do is quickly take you through what is a critical analysis based on the work that myself and Richard Jackson and Jeroen Gunning started to do in 2005 at Aberystwyth, leading to the formation of what's been referred to by Mciahel and others as CTS, Critical Terrorism Studies. And really our initiative and our direction of travel has been to critique very much of what has been written in orthodox terrorism studies and problematize some of that. And I was making some notes as I was listening to the earlier speakers. And I want to say, first of all, I'm resistant to the language in terrorism studies. I don't like the term terrorist. And the reason I don't like it is it's a political act to attribute that identity to anyone. It's a judgment. And what you're saying is, I don't approve of you. I don't approve of what you're doing. I reflect on recently at the death of Madiba Nelson Mandela, I was asked to write an obituary for him, which I did. And as a result of that being published on the internet, I was trolled by people who berated me for writing a laudatory obituary for a terrorist. I managed to track down the identity of one of the trolls, who happened to be a retired British Army general who was still living in the past. And of course, in the past, we did regard Mandela as a terrorist. However, he's been rehabilitated and reinstated as a global statesman and so on, and a saint to all intents and purposes in more recent times. But actually, I was also reflecting as I was listening to the analogy about the toilet flushing. And what strikes me about that analogy is what's in the toilet? Or might I ask, indeed, who is in the toilet? And it does seem to me that there is a huge problem about the processes by which we intellectualize and we try to understand the use of violence in the political arena. And by that I mean that the process that we engage in almost invariably is one of dehumanization. And the problem, amongst others, with dehumanization is that it's profoundly anti-intellectual. It's anti-intelligent. It precludes intelligence, as a matter of fact. And I think that is something that we do well to remember when we begin to look at the problems of violence in the world. It's a knee-jerk, we all do it. If someone is pointing a gun at your head or attacking you, it's very difficult indeed to see them as a human being. Nonetheless, we are scholars, at least I'm a scholar, and there are many other scholars in the room, and we are required by our profession to engage our brains, not our guts. And so I think that is the impulse that led us to begin to set up critical terrorism studies, because there's a very, very much in the arena written about terrorism that is written not from the brain, but from the gut. And it gets us in, as Laura has amply demonstrated, it gets us into even deeper doo-doo in that toilet. It doesn't solve anything. It actually makes matters worse. It feeds certain economic and political interests, and we'll come to that in a moment, but it actually, if we're interested in a peaceful world in which security can be shared by all of us, this is not the path to travel. And so that's a little introduction to what I wanted to say about that. I think the other thing I'll say, and I'm kind of preempting some of the things that are in the slides, but never mind, I do that all the time. The other thing I want to say is my late husband was a mathematician, and he also taught physics. And what strikes me when we look at Laura's data in particular is the physics of human interaction. The idea that one action leads to a reaction. And therefore, the action that we take, we must think about what and anticipate and deal with the anticipated reaction. And we know enough from the prosecution of the lamented war on terror to know that certain directions will not bear fruit. At least they'll not bear fruit in terms of improved human security, and particularly improved global human security. The next thing I want to say, and Richard Falk and I were talking before we started, about our common lack of qualification to speak about politics at all, because neither of us, as a matter of fact, have any degrees in politics. My background has been in working as a clinician in mental health to begin with. I'm from Northern Ireland, so that kind of puts you in the pot, as it were. But my degrees are in sociology, using large N studies, and also in psychology. So, and Richard, as you know, is a lawyer and a very eminent advocate for human rights and so on. But basically, with that kind of excuse, I will say that as someone looking in, it's very difficult for me to see terrorism and political violence outside of the context of struggles in world power, and particularly the histories of colonialism and imperialism. And I think, and of course, we have Orientalism in there as well. And I think we really do need to keep going back to our own very limited qualifications, either as a Westerner or as someone from the Middle East, because each of us have been blinkered by the history and the socialization that we have in one or other of those very bifurcated worlds. And bringing those kind of more broad visions, I think, to the problem of political violence is absolutely required when we begin to try and find solutions. Okay, so let me see if I can now retrieve what I was going to talk about. I wanted to look a little bit at the war on terror. I'm not going to be telling you anything that you don't know already, but so we look at the legacy or the effects of the war on terror, and I'm going to use, for very good reasons, largely studies and evaluations from within the United States. I'm not going to look at any of our critical stuff. I'm going to use the orthodox evaluations to show you what the evaluations currently stand. So the study at Brown University, the Cost of War Project, in April 2004, found that 350,000 people were killed at a cost of 4.4 trillion, and that Al-Qaeda was responsible for roughly 3,000 of those deaths, of which only 2% were Westerners. If you add the deaths at 2001, that brings you up to 6,000, which means that Al-Qaeda is responsible for about 1.7% of the deaths that have resulted from the war on terror. The rest, unfortunately, are at our hands. And I think this is a very useful way to look at what, in fact, has been going on. And of course, my own field, I count casualties. And I use casualties as a surrogate for looking at the effects of violence and the prosecutions of wars and armed conflicts. And latterly, I've become preoccupied with the counting of injury. And the reason for that is that deaths, in a way, are a discrete event. Injury is not only an economic problem for the society, it's a political problem. It's a political problem because it creates and it embodies grievance in the communities in which war is prosecuted. And we don't even begin, and I have failed miserably to persuade any of the authorities to begin to think about counting injuries. They regard me as a crazy woman when I begin to talk about this. I've done it for Northern Ireland, by the way, but I can't persuade anybody else that there's any merit in the idea. And it's very complicated because do you count physical injuries? Do you count psychological injuries? Do you count both? How do you draw the parameters and so on? But nonetheless, in terms of the outputs of the global war on terror, we're looking at a disaster. We're looking at something that has set out to solve a problem, and it has created a myriad of other problems. The UN Independent Joint Anti-Corruption Monitoring and Evaluation Committee estimates that only 10% of the monies that were allocated for reconstruction in Afghanistan were met where they went where they were supposed to go. So not only has the prosecution of the hot war been a disaster, but actually the efforts, paltry as they are, I have to say, at reconstruction they have lined the pockets of many people in this country, and they have failed miserably to reconstruct the societies that have been devastated by the targeting in the war on terror. They also have had the unhappy outflow, and for all sorts of reasons to do with the way in which the war on terror was constructed, they have had the unhappy consequence of destabilizing a whole region of the world. And I'll come back to that when I talk about the way we look at these things later. Okay. I've talked a little bit about this earlier when I talked about the physics of human interaction. And it does seem to me, having lived for 40 years in a war zone in Northern Ireland, that there is a dance that we do. And it's between terrorism and counterterrorism. And it's a bit like doing a rumba or a foxtrot or anything else. Your partner steps forward and you step back. You step forward, your partner steps back. So in a sense, counterterrorism is always fighting the last terrorist attack because we ban liquids on airplanes after the fact. We ban all these things after somebody has done something successfully with them. And of course, if you're a smart person trying to plan the next attack, you're going to think of something different. You're not going to do the same thing again, particularly in the light of target hardening. So it does seem to me that it's amazing to me that, in fact, we haven't really sat and thought about that more than we actually have. We've talked about military responses in Laura's talk, their ineffectiveness. In fact, do we really think the US is safer? And I'll come back to that. And I do think we need to also, in the context of the West, to contextualize why it is we privilege military responses. And the answer I come up, in common with many others, is the military-industrial complex. And we saw this in Northern Ireland. When peace broke out, there were a lot of people very unhappy indeed because they lost their jobs. Their businesses went down the toilet, that same toilet, because they no longer had to provide new glass for windows that were no longer being blown out in bomb explosions. There were people who were no longer getting huge danger money and overtime pay in the prisons, and so on and so forth. There are people whose careers are built on war continuing, and they will fight tooth and nail to continue the war. And indeed, in my country, they still do that. They still complain about peace. They say it's not peace, but we want to go back and finish the job. And what they want is their jobs back. And so basically we have to see that writ large in the United States in terms of the arms industry, in terms of the huge military aid that's provided by this country to various parts of the world, and how that drives certain kinds of responses over others. And I think, I also want to talk a little bit about, very briefly, about culture and intelligence. I used to be in the United States Institute of Peace here in Washington, D.C. And when I was there at the very beginning of the declaration of the war in Iraq in 2002, 2003. And there was a person there who worked with me who at that time was involved in policing in Afghanistan. And he was a former government official here in the United States. I went back several years later, and he was due to serve the same amount of time as I was. He was due to leave at the same time as I did. So I went back to Ireland, and I went back several years later, and he was still there. And I said, "Oh, I thought you were finished." And he said, No. He said, "I'm here. I'm an Iraq expert." And so I said, "Well, have you been to Iraq?" "No," he said defensively, "but none of the other Iraq experts have been to Iraq either." "Do you speak Arabic?" "No, I don't. None of the other." So basically, I think when we look at how this country in particular, but also the UK, understands what it is they're doing in the rest of the world, it might be a good idea if we actually employed people who understood and who spoke the language and who had some intelligence about how societies operate, realizing that in fact that the world does not operate under the same conditions in the same cultural way as this country does. And I think that's been a comprehensive failure. We saw this in Northern Ireland, and we were very close to Britain, but we used to laugh because you could spot the spy in the local communities. It's quite easy to do if you're a local person. And that kind of blunt instrument approach, and rather unintelligent in both senses of the word approach, is one of the problems that we've been dealing with. The other thing about the war on terror is that it has largely made the legislative frameworks that have been imposed across the world have largely been responsible for making peace negotiations impossible. This has happened in the Sri Lankan case, where the Balansingham was unable to come to this country to participate in the last round, as it turned out to be the last round of peace talks, because he was put on a terrorist watch list, even though he was in fact a civilian. It happened in the Philippines, and various other places, where actually the legislative frameworks, the listing of certain organizations, makes negotiation impossible, and therefore commits not just this country but the rest of the world to a path of militarism rather than negotiation. And I think this is a big problem. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about Alex Schmidt was mentioned earlier, and I want, again, in line with my offering to you of analysis from the rather orthodox field. This is what Schmidt and Singh in 2011 concluded about the war on terror. So not only did the US not achieve outright success by its own measures, but in constructing an exceptional Al-Qaeda, it arguably empowered the enemy. For the Western press, a military project has led to a degradation of US power and standing in the world, and has betrayed those standards it wished to import to other countries. The Arab press perceived failure in the misdirection of power. America is losing because it prioritized a military response over working for social and political change, and by asserting its hegemony through military might. Now, Schmidt has not joined critical terrorism studies by any stretch of the imagination. And it's with very little pleasure I say, we told you so. We did see this coming. This is, unfortunately, the lesson of my life in Northern Ireland, also my participation in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. These lessons are not new to some of us, but unfortunately, they seem to be new, and they're very hard-won lessons. I also want to now talk a little bit about America in the world, because I love this country. I come here regularly. I've lived here on a number of occasions. I think it's a great place. I think the people are wonderful. However, that is not how the rest of the world sees America these days. Anti-Americanism is at an all-time high. I work in Pakistan, I work in South Africa, and they invite me to speak rather than Laura because I'm not American. That's the fact of the matter. So I think we have a problem here in rehabilitating the role of the United States in the world and the attitude to Americans in the rest of the world. And that is going to be a hard job to do. It requires the United States to reconsider its place in the world, its role as a world leader, and how, in fact, it offers not just military leadership, but moral leadership. By its renewed compliance with international human rights standards, with its respect for other nations, as opposed to what went on in the War on Terror, where it went in and demanded the compliance from other nations at George Bush's speech. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And over again, when I work in Pakistan, when I work in South Africa, people are very resentful of this way of imposing a US agenda which takes no account whatsoever of the domestic concerns of those governments. And in fact, it creates problems for them domestically with their Muslim populations and with various other things. I think we have to have our ears open. We have to redesign these relationships outside of a coercive exchange. And actually that would be, in fact, the more intelligent way to go. Okay, we now have the Obama doctrine, because we had the election of a president who said he was going to reverse the direction. And in fact, I think he genuinely tried to do so. Unfortunately, I don't think it worked. And I think it didn't work for all sorts of reasons which you're more familiar with than I am. What it did do, however, is it did create, and I think I agree with this analysis, some sort of a vacuum militarily in the Middle East, which has led to very interesting developments in relation to the Saudi-Turkish alliance and the rumouring of some other kind of NATO-type force in the Muslim world. I think this is to be welcomed, actually. I don't think it's something to be scared of. And I think a lot of what's happened here is US policies abroad have been driven by fear. And that's a mistake. 2 minutes I've got. This is going to be quick. Obama has replaced the whole-scale, boots-on-the-ground approach with targeted killing and drone attacks. I think these have escalated beyond anything. I don't have the graphs here, but I've used them in the past. You can see a proliferation of drone attacks since Obama came into office. So it's not true to say that it's not been a military-free. He's used militarism, but he's used it in a way that's avoided US casualties, and it's created terror in northern Pakistan, for example, where now drones are actually silent. You don't even hear them anymore overhead. So I'm not going to do there. I'm going to quickly what I want to do is I want to give you a little laugh. Before I go, since I only have 2 minutes left. I want to talk about the future. And what I want to do is bring out the things that I've wrapped up in my scarf. Okay, so let's talk about the future now. Because it does seem to me that we have one of two options, unfortunately, from my point of view, because neither of them, frankly, for me, in terms of US foreign policy and the prosecution of ending the global war on terror or that kind of approach, neither of them look promising to me. First of all, Mrs. Clinton has proven herself to be much more hawkish in her impulses than I would certainly prefer. And I think she's much more hawkish than a lot of what's gone on. Her track record within the Obama administration is that she has preferred the more military option. So that's the first problem. The second problem, I don't even want to talk about, because, I mean, there is actually a volatility here. And within this rather wobbly head, who knows what goes on in terms of foreign policy. But it doesn't look good. I mean, Trump has risen, in my opinion, to prominence on the back of a disgruntled, impoverished middle class and the perceived threat to white privilege in this society, allied to the enormous racism that's been directed against the Obama administration. So I think those are the things that have fueled his rise, none of which are impulses that I think we ought to celebrate, nor indeed can we rely on them to deliver us any kind of positive future in this regard. I end with a plea, which is, this needs to be rethought. Thank you.
Thank you to each of our speakers for a very promising beginning. I hope you've been stimulated. We'll take questions.
I think the idea of looking at indiscriminate versus repressive actions and how that either stimulates or suppresses violence is really important and long overdue. And it reminds me and makes me think about the scholarly work on sort of the repression mobilization nexus, which I assume you're familiar with. I am wondering why, and this is something I was thinking about before the bobbleheads appeared, but why you chose to focus on Muslims, especially when you're looking at in the 1990s, when this is the era in the US, when it's really the anti-government, Christian patriot, Timothy McVeigh, murdering all those people, including many children, in the building in Oklahoma City, that's really much more important. So, and I see this as a research question in terms of sort of truncating your observations, just purely, but also normatively. And this sort of era of poisonous politics, it's incumbent on all of us to be not associating domestic terrorism with Muslims.
Absolutely. The only reason that I presented what I presented today is because of the charge of the conference. I have a lot more data on right-wing extremism. I've done a lot of the analysis. I actually, had I not had to come here, I would know a lot more about it. I have some preliminary results with right-wing extremism. That's the first paper that's going to come out of these data. I think it's incredibly important, particularly with what's happening today politically and how much power a lot of the right-wing extremism has had in influencing our federal government, which is probably controversial, but it has. And so, yeah, I promise that's there. And I'm on sabbatical, and I'm just dying to get to that. Particularly, I mean, I can give you a little heads up. We collect a lot of information on what's going on through the federal government in terms of policy. And so we've elicited a list of about 17 issues that the right-wing extremists have very vocally spoken up against and for, and we've coded all of those. And looking at just the whole repressive, discriminate, and indiscriminate thing, what we found is that conciliation and repression lead to an increase for those policies. And so we've went through and coded whether they're policies or not. And what we'll look at is whether we still have that when there's a Republican president. And so I think it's just a backlash for like, if it's on the agenda, we're going to fight, regardless of whether it's in our best interest or not. So I promise you it's coming.
Let me first thank the panel for three very stimulating and illuminating presentations. I have a question for Laura and for Marie. For Laura, wouldn't it be enriching the idea of conciliation if one also considered legitimate grievances? Mm-hmm. In other words, it seems to me that a lot of the causal foundation for recourse to political violence was premised on the aftermath of colonialism, or some way of characterizing that helps us understand why extremist kinds of responses emerge. Now, I don't know if you can fit that into the kind of methodology that you've employed very effectively, but I think somehow or other, to me, it's part of the picture.
For sure.
And how one gets that into play is the question.
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing and the purpose of collecting these data is so that we can dig deeper into it, just like I explained that we went through and then coded the policy stuff once we realized what was going on here, and why I said that, looking at this sort of backlash towards conciliation we need to actually go in and look at the actions and perhaps look at them according to whether these are legitimate grievances that are being addressed versus something else. And I think, so that's something that can be done. We haven't done it yet because we're looking at just a first sweep of the data. But for sure, looking at this idea of conciliation isn't necessarily, it's a simple word for a complex dynamic, right? Some of the actions are, so we collected data in Israel, and it's some of the actions are allowing utilities to go into refugee camps. The refugee camps need utilities, and so we coded that as conciliation. It isn't about just giving people a nickel or something like that. So I'm hoping we'll be able to look at this a little bit more refined, for sure. Thank you.
And for Marie, really two-part question. Underneath the military-industrial complex, it seems to me that there's a kind of ideological consensus among world leaders, not just America, what sometimes described as political realism, which accords historical agency to military, exaggerates the historical agency of military power as contributing to the unfolding of history. And this was, I think, largely true up to the end of World War II, but has been declining. The agency of military power has been declining, but the ideological outlook of leaders has not adapted, partly maybe because of the military, however one defines the military-industrial complex. And the other little question was your conception of better experts that know the language and know. My understanding of British colonial theory was they were very sophisticated about the birth of anthropology, for instance, was to control the natives better. And it seems to me that better experts might be more insidious, not less.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, the realism and the way that it drives a military default position on the part of world leaders, I agree with you. And therefore, I think it's very, very difficult. And I don't think this is a good example, frankly. Although Laura's probably going to disagree with me, but anyway, I don't think this is a good example of what I'm about to say, which is I think there are huge issues about gender in the practice of politics. I'm not entirely sure that that this is the solution, but I think comprehensively, I think there's a way in which a hypermasculinity has driven a great deal of what passes for world politics in the contemporary arena. So I think there are other issues which I don't have time to get into here, but in my teaching, I talk about systems of subordination, and race is the other one, of course. And in fact, I was tempted to respond to the question here about right-wing extremism, why not include it? In fact, I would go much further than that, because the longer I live, the more I believe that, in fact, all violence is political. So if we look at what police violence is doing in this country and the mass incarceration of people of colour, I think there is a way in which of looking at that as a form of state terror. And so I think we've got to really question some of the parameters that we're working with here. Your second question is about better experts. I think I'm saying that on an understanding that we see a transformed political leadership in not just the United States but in other parts of the world, where governments take seriously their duty to their citizens to deliver security in the sense of human security. And that has been an abject failure. I mean, basically, we look at the refugee problem that has been the output of the global war on terror to a large extent. And the abject derogation of responsibility for the human security of those human beings by the global leaders is an illustration of how, in fact, security has come to mean the military security of the state, rather than security in the way that I would like to define it. So we can't really talk about better experts and better intelligence in the current status quo, because I'm profoundly unhappy with the current status quo. It requires a transformation of that, dare I say, a revolution. That we have to really look at security as a much broader concept, and where we in the United States, you work in partnership with other leaders in other countries and recognize a common interest, not one that's imposed from the US down, but one that is a genuine partnership and a meeting of responsibilities between leaders in various parts of the world.
A couple of things I'd like to know. First of all, Mark, very interesting historiography. I would say that there is a very large literature that actually, within the context of civil war and terrorism, so Erica and Laura's paper in ASR, that actually shows that if you beat people, they tend to beat you back. So repression actually matters. Research by Ted Gurr, who you mentioned, research by a whole bunch of other people, shows that yes, repression has a bad outcome. And I think that we need to be more aware and engaged with this kind of research because it's there. A lot of times policymakers don't pay attention to it. That's a different problem. But the fact that we have a lot of research that shows repressing people is a good way to have them pick up guns is there. In terms, Mary, in terms of your comment about gender, so I completely agree. This is something that needs to be paid a lot more attention to. Some current research shows, actually, that organizations in the Middle East that have gender-inclusive ideologies are much less likely to use violence than organizations, and I'll be talking about this tomorrow a little bit, but organizations that have gender-inclusive ideologies are less likely to use violence and more likely to protest, and organizations that have patriarchal ideologies are more likely to move in the direction of using violence, although those findings are less strong. So I think you're raising the issue of gender and how we look at that is really key, and that feeds in many ways, given the governments that are in the Middle East and other countries and how they feed into a patriarchal ideologies. I think that's very important in terms of how we think about political violence and lowering levels of political violence.
Thank you for all of your presentations. So Laura, not to beat up on you just a bit, I think part of my discomfort is twofold. I think the word Muslim terrorism, to me, rather than I think what's more commonly used as Salafi or Jihadi, or in other words, to not sort of with such a wide brush. So it's not that you didn't include right wing, because I'm sure you will, and I'm sure you'll include LTTE and all the other groups that you have focused on. So it's not it's just sort of to rethink perhaps some of the terminology, because I know it's not what you think, but I think that it brushes with maybe perhaps a broad stroke inadvertently. Because for me, looking at Öcalan and the PKK, they may be Muslim, but they're Marxist. And so the religious element is almost sort of extraneous to it. So it was just more as a tweaking. It's not a criticism. It's just perhaps the way it's couched. And for Marie Breen-Smyth, first of all, love the Profs. I don't disagree with you, which
It's amazing.
Well, no, you and I agree on a lot more than we disagree. For me, critical terrorism studies is it, I mean, if you read, well, I don't know if you've ever read my work, but if you read my work, I agree. I talk about motivation. I fight against people like Ronnie Flanagan, who used to say, no, 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 no. If you try to understand them, you're supporting them. And so I've never agreed with that, and so I've spent time on the Falls Road, or I've spent time in camps, or I've spent time with the LTT, and I've spent time, and I agree with you about this notion of expertise. What I'm increasingly uncomfortable is the fact that with the advent of Twitter and social media and all of these platforms, these instant pundits of people who never leave their office, who don't speak a word of the language, who've never visited, who have very strong opinions that then they pretend is data. And they, in part because they may have thousands of followers, or they may get invited onto CNN, or to address the most important centers of power, that they have a disproportionate influence. And I have actually said that I personally find it, fallacious that anyone is a jihadi expert that doesn't speak Arabic. And the response to this by a colleague at Northeastern was to say, well, there's more than one way to skin a cat. No, it's fake. If you can't read the text and you're working in translation, you are losing so much. So I agree entirely with the need for experts. The problem has been the issue of clearance, access, and the fact that someone who spends 2 months in Iraq can be an Iraq expert without knowing anything about the 1940s or even going back further. The issue, however, and this is the one point I will push back on, I think it's important that occasionally when we are looking at terrorist activities, rather than as an identity, that they do go beyond the pale of what is acceptable practice, even when facing injustice, even when there are grievances. There are certain lines that should not be crossed. And so that we can make perhaps a nuanced distinction between a group like ISIS and how they treat women, and how they treat children, and how they treat other Muslims, and how they treat Shia, and how they treat Yazidi, and so on, versus some of these post-colonial nationalist organizations that are first fighting off the British, the French, the Germans, and so on, the Libyans, and then other groups. So, I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater as someone who has been doing this for 27 years and spent a lot of time to try to learn the languages in order to understand exactly what you're talking about. There are certain things that are in fact terrorists. Like, I don't want to say that it's completely constructed. I want to put maybe some nuance in that categorization.
Let me take the privilege of the chair and say that when I was listening to each of the three of you, for very different reasons, a particular article came up in my mind that from more than 30 years ago, which is an article by Steve Wright called something like A Time Series Analysis of the Northern Ireland Conflict. Mm-hmm. And what Steve Wright did at the time, and why it's apropos in terms of what each of the different things you brought up, is that he did an analysis of IRA actions and British government, particularly Army, counterreactions. And it's interesting in the sense that it ties together a number of things, because it's looking at the difference. The British Army, I won't summarize the whole thing, but each time they got a new toy, I'll call it, weapon, they basically used it and used every bit of whatever was given to them in that 30-day period. He had monthly statistics. So when it was tear gas was introduced, every single canister of tear gas was deployed in that next month. When rubber bullets were introduced, every rubber bullet was during that month, et cetera. In the meantime, the IRA actions were going up and down based on a whole different set of interactions and concerns on their part. So you had the bureaucratic response, in essence, in terms of a policy implementation, use everything you've got and without a change in tactic and response, and the IRA responding in the other direction. The other thing that's connected to that is, of course, that didn't help the interaction between the two and the negotiations that were even at that time that were underway. The other thing was that the data that he had acquired, and this is in part to Mark's point, was actually given to him by the British Army, for which Steve Wright one night was arrested because the Army heard that he had this data. Someone else had heard this data, and they swooped in. He was writing it was a dissertation project, and they found him, and this is the days of the old big computer printouts, and so they found him with piles and piles of quote, secret data in his house. And so he spent a good 72 hours in a jail outside of Lancaster while they tried to sort this out. So he had the data was because, in fact, somebody in the military wanted to analyze what they were doing and to see if there was an independent source could come up with an analysis of why they were failing. But of course, someone else in the enterprise thought that obviously this was for nefarious reasons. The point being that there's a lot of information and studies out there that in fact can teach some valuable lessons about conciliatory and repressive actions, et cetera. But they may not be on the same cases, and they may not be in the same period, and they may not use the same techniques, but there's a lot of information out there that might help us ask some of the same questions that we're asking now, and maybe, just maybe, move us along a little more quickly than we have moved in the past.
Yeah. Can I go
yeah.
back to Maya? I mean, first of all, just on the back of that, as an undergraduate student, we did some research in Republican West Belfast. And the university that I was associated with then, and have now reassociated myself with now, Queen's University, made an agreement with the British Army that they would hand over all the social science data to the British Army, which placed our lives in danger, frankly, because we had collected the data on the understanding that it was used for research purposes only, and we would hold it, which is actually a kind of interesting story in the light of the piece I'm writing about now, which is the Boston College case, which, if you're not familiar with, you should familiarize yourself if you're a researcher in this field. Anyhow, we had to organize a bonfire on the front lawn of the university and invite the press and burn what then was 80-column cards to make sure that everybody in West Belfast knew that our data was not, in fact, going to the British Army. And those are the lengths to which we went at that time. So I'm very alive to the idea that access and so on is a huge problem, and it's something we negotiate. But you know what? We're in this field. We know this already. If you don't like it, go work on, consumer affairs or something, I mean, this is what we have to work with. We have to find ways around these things, Maya, now, you don't have to tell me that terrorism as a method, which it is a problem. It is a huge problem. My work has been with victims. My work tells me every single day that it's a huge problem. However, it is a problem that is generated not just by non-state actors, but by state actors par excellence. They cause far many more casualties than any non-state actor. I do see it as a problem. I'm not a pacifist. I'm not adhering to some kind of kumbaya solution. I think there are places in which military resistance is necessary and military intervention is necessary. Unfortunately, in the face of genocides, we haven't done it when it was called for, and yet we do it when I think it's counterproductive. I think there are solutions to terrorism. I think those solutions are to do with the commitments I talked about earlier on the part of world governments, but on the part of governments facing non-state actors, I think there are other ways of looking at this than the ways we currently use. I interviewed Peter Sheridan, who was the head of counter-terrorism in Northern Ireland for many years, and like Ronnie Flanagan, was one of the first Catholics to hold such a position. Ronnie Flanagan distinguished himself not, whereas Peter Sheridan, as head of counterterrorism, did distinguish himself. And he argues to this day that the ordinary criminal law is sufficient to prosecute any act of terrorism. There is absolutely no need for exceptional measures. There's no need for emergency legislation. There's no need for the Guantanamo Bays of this world. We have at our disposal a raft of criminal justice measures and prisons to match. So we don't need, in fact, to exceptionalize this as any other kind of violence. I think we have to harden targets, obviously, and there is a duty on the part of government to make their citizens safe. But there is also a duty on the part of government to protect the human rights of everybody. And I think that's the part that we've fallen down on. I hope that's answered it. I do think that it is a huge problem, but I don't think we're on the right path to finding solutions.
Thank you.